Basically, we're going to be talking about the Fourth Amendment and digital privacy because that's really all that's at stake here. All of the surveillance I'm going to talk about is in digital in nature. And I'll talk about why it may give us pause for concern, while I think in the social, a lot of people shared, and I, up until not, I would say up until, geez, I don't know when it, like in the last couple of years, like I generally sort of agreed with, the consensus that, hey, as long as you're not a bad guy, the government's never going to use that against you, which is a fair argument when you have a government that is serving the people. But the more that we learn about what our government has done, then I would argue, it's probably I had that kind of blind trust before things like Guantanamo, seeing what our government did, and then before reading a lot of Noam Chomsky books, which if you haven't read any history by Noam Chomsky, I recommend learning about that. So to Yana's point about criticizing the US government, Noam Chomsky, when I read his books, I was like, how is this guy still alive? And then I felt like, wow, we do live in a free and fair country, that this guy, even for pointing out all the really bad things the US government has done over decades and decades, he's still alive and, living to tell the tale. Um, I would say, you know, uh, that said, I'm gonna give some pause for concern about the possibilities that could happen with tonight's topic and the direction things are going. That said, I'm gonna basically I'm gonna read to you the core text of the Fourth Amendment of the United States for those that are interested in the specific words. It's the right of the people to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. And when we talk about search and seizure, we need to talk about it in the context within which the Fourth Amendment was written, which is colonial America. Well, just before colonial America, but around the time of when the most that someone could do is search your place of your home, basically your the place that you lived, and look at what was written on your quill. You can see in the picture, literally that was what they were writing on, is quills, or writing with, on a regular basis. And while that was really written, and the Fourth Amendment was written to focus on physical privacy, that's because that's really all there was back then. There was no digital anything. There was nothing digital. The idea of the computer hadn't even been a twinkle in anyone's mind. The closest, I forget what year the Babbage machine came about, but that would be probably the closest thing. Let me do a quick. Yeah, no, it wasn't even close. 1821 was the Babbage machine. So that would have been the first thing that anyone could call a computer. So yeah, we weren't anywhere near that. So the Fourth Amendment, if you're reading it strictly, should cover pretty much anything that someone could want to keep secret that wasn't told to another human being. Essentially, back in the time of the writing of the Fourth Amendment. So keep that in mind for the context. And then let's talk about when are searches legally permissible, because people talked about terrorists. Well, I agree with you guys. We should be tracking terrorists. We should be figuring out when they're doing illegal things, and we should figure out what they're up to. And there have been a lot of terrorist plots that have been caught and prevented. Not always Sorry about that. Let me go on silent. Not always because or it's not always getting the news that you would want, because we don't want to necessarily, like, um you know uh proselytize the fact that we are good at catching terrorists, because if you do that, then terrorists will try to avoid the ways that they're being caught. So it's hopefully not a newsworthy event, but it is something that has happened. I've seen news of it, but it's probably happening more than we know about. And probable cause, by the way, is the term uh, that says when a search is legally permissible. And probable cause says that someone has a reasonable basis for thinking that there was a crime that's been committed. And I think it also includes, or that if someone is going to commit a crime, and then you can get a warrant to describe what's going to be searched and the government, what the government is looking for to find out of that probable cause, having a probable cause to search the person. And then this basically prevents the government from just looking at anything and everything they want of every single citizen, and non-citizen, quite frankly. Um, uh, Although theoretically the Constitution doesn't safeguard anyone internationally from the U.S. government. Um, but the idea is to protect against overly broad searches, or intrusions into privacy. There was always a sense from the founding fathers, having come out of Europe, where there were a lot of crackdowns by monarchies, and in terms of violating people's individual rights. They wanted to protect those rights from the government, where the government would be used as a force for good, but not a force for violating privacy. So digital privacy, the idea of digital privacy, when you talk about the Fourth Amendment, like I said, we have to look in context of when the Fourth Amendment was written, and because there was no digital anything at the time. Really, if you look at the modern equivalents of what was protected by the Fourth Amendment when it was written, you would consider letters, notes jotted down, etc. The modern equivalent of those things are actually the footprint that we leave today is actually far more vast than the footprint of a person back then. But now you would probably consider emails, text messages, browsing history, location data that someone mentioned about GPSs. All of that would be considered personal information that is, more or less equivalent to the same types of things that the Fourth Amendment was written for. So the question is there any reason that the Fourth Amendment should not apply to these digital equivalents of what the Fourth Amendment was written for in its original context? So basically, there have been government programs that have been revealed that showed extensive surveillance, like the NSA's bulk data collection efforts. There was metadata that was tracked without about individual activities without accessing actual content, and that's what was first revealed. And basically, this type of thing was happening. It was like phone call from this phone number to this phone number, but it was related to how US people were interacting with someone from another country, usually who was, usually, if not always, I think it was actually always, that was a suspect of some sort of terrorism, or some sort of national security issue. So it was pretty, how do I say, uh, not really like detailed information. It was just something that it was metadata, data about data. And it wasn't actual phone call recordings or anything like that. But it was done without warrants, which was not um, uh, allowed by that at that time legally. Now, Edward Snowden basically talked about his role in the NSA's widespread surveillance practices. He explained how the NSA was collecting information without probable cause or warrants, and um, he basically ended up having to run away from prosecution by the U.S. government. We talked last week about whistleblowers, and Snowden was one of those whistleblowers, and how he had to seek asylum in Russia. You might ask, well, given the adversarial relationship between the US and Russia recently, and even back then, it was actually much better. But why did Snowden go to Russia? Well, Russia is someone that could actually protect him from the US government, and Russia benefited from Snowden's disclosure because Russia and the US tend to want to discredit each other, and this was a discredit to the US government. So it made Russia a good place for Snowden to hide to. So that's where he went. And basically, uh, the question is whether or not digital surveillance aligns with principles of the Fourth Amendment. And I would argue that given that the Fourth Amendment protected all of the things that you could essentially keep private at that time and day of um, the writing of the Fourth Amendment, I would argue it does very much apply to digital content as well. Uh, Pointing out like data on sorry, give me 1 second. I just want to pause for 1 second. Okay. So basically looking at data on like in the initial disclosures of the types of data that was being disclosed was not really very damning. As I mentioned, it was metadata. It wasn't really detailed or very personal. Um, and there is, as people mentioned in the social, a balance between privacy and national security. And I still, to this day, feel pretty comfortable that all of that type of data being shared with the government doesn't seem like a big deal to me. That said, when it turned out that the government was caught doing that um, uh, that sort of surveillance without warrants. It was originally pointed out that it was illegal, but Congress then retroactively legalized it. But let's talk a little bit about some of the legal loopholes that have been used. And we'll start with the Patriot Act, which was basically designed to strengthen national security so that it would be easier to detect and prevent terrorism. And it expanded surveillance powers, allowing the government access to tangible things, meaning books, records, documents that are relevant to national security investigation. The idea was that you could do bulk collection of the metadata that we were talking about in and um, you know roving wiretaps, which is surveillance on a target even if they switch phones or locations, making it easier to monitor individuals who frequently change communication methods. To me, that also seems very justifiable in that if you have a suspected terrorist target and they swap phones, you can't wait until you have to get a wiretap on the new, or you have to get a warrant on um, a new phone number that this person had, or they would have six phones and they would just swap back and forth, while they're committing their crimes and causing their terrorism. So, that seems very justifiable. There was another thing called sneak and peek warrants, which allows law enforcement to delay notifying individuals of search warrants, particularly in cases where such notice might jeopardize an investigation. And that makes sense to me too, in that if you're gonna tell someone that they're the subject of a search warrant, and that's going to clue them in to not, you know, do something that would have, you know, um, that to not do something that basically like it would clue them into the fact that someone was onto the fact that they were, you know, doing something that was potentially a national security threat. I can understand where that's coming from too. It did raise concerns about critics basically said this overly broad surveillance without the traditional protections of probable cause and specific warrants was, unjustified, and talked about, privacy concerns, leading to a lot of debate and reforms, such as the U.S. Freedom Act of 2015, which restricted bulk metadata collection. Now, I'm going to give a little background on the FISA, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which came around in 1978. It established procedures for physical and electronic surveillance and the collection of foreign intelligence information between foreign powers and agents of foreign powers suspected of espionage or terrorism. It created a special court for warrants and operated under secrecy. The court allowed the government to conduct surveillance with less transparency and due process than in typical criminal cases. And the expanded powers of the FISA Amendments Act of 2008, which permitted the government to collect communications of non-US persons located outside the US, but incidental collection that often included Americans' data. It enabled large-scale data collection from internet communication, emails, and calls when foreign targets are involved. Controversy would be that the FISA court's secretive nature basically could lead to significant privacy issues because Americans' communication could often be incidentally collected without probable cause or specific warrants. Even that, like I could sort of see with that description. I could see a lot of justification for it. The PRISM program, which was revealed by Edward Snowden, relied on FISA authorization and involved major tech companies. And this is where it gets concerning for me. It includes Google, Facebook, Microsoft sharing user data with the NSA and for intelligence gathering, which creates more of a concern about privacy and the role of tech companies in surveillance. So, we can we I think it'll be interesting in the conversation portion of the evening to talk about what do we consider the sweet spot between giving disclosure, or giving do we want to give carte blanche to the government to be able to see and hear anything that they can set their eyes on, and force them to ask corporations to give over any information about citizens to the government in their efforts without any checks or balances in that process, or should there be some level of privacy that people can be afforded that prevents an unreasonable search and seizure according to the Fourth Amendment? And I guess the second type of question that I would ask is, if we are going to allow the government to have that information, I would argue that, if we're not going to be hypocrites, we have to codify that with an amendment to the Constitution, because the Fourth Amendment clearly says that personal effects should not be searched by the government. We now have multiple laws recently that are contradicting that, but those laws are not legally allowed to contradict that if they're not if there's no amendment to amend the Fourth Amendment to say that digital privacy is not considered privacy. So speaking of PRISM and the Fourth Amendment, let's talk a little bit more about both of those. So imagine that some well-meaning but insecure politician, I'm not naming any names here, I'm just saying in the future of the American Republic, knew every piece of information on you and everyone that you knew, and everything that you and everyone you knew put on the internet. And suppose they were so insecure that they didn't want to hear any criticism of themselves. and that they wanted to silence or at worst eliminate or exterminate anyone that didn't support them. What would stop them from doing that if they had the FBI, CIA, and military at their command and could, basically, and had all of this information on all of the citizens of the country? Now, so imagine that you're not one of those people, right? You're actually a supporter of the said person, and you're just not as much. And suppose that you're actually, let me give a different example. So suppose that you're at a company and your company's CEO is a supporter of said uh, politician, but your CEO is not as much of a supporter as the CEO of a competitive firm. And let's suppose that that politician decided they wanted to take all the secrets of your company and share them with the competitor because they wanted their better supporter to be more successful in business, because they wanted to show that people who support them do better in general because they're better business people potentially. But actually, unbeknownst to you and anyone else in either of those companies, actually the secrets of your company were being given to the secrets of the competitor who had a more loyal to the politician CEO. So would that be a cause for concern? I would argue the first scenario that I gave hopefully is super unlikely to happen anytime in the near future. The second solution, or the second possibility, I would argue is much more likely to be able to happen if there is too much power put into too few people's hands without proper checks and balances. And I would argue that the current practices basically set precedents for future privacy rights. And I think it's really important that we stay true to our Constitution unless we're going to amend the Constitution. And if we are going to amend it, we should have a good reason for doing so. And if we look at as much as I think the tragedy of 9/11, which, I was a young professional when that happened, it was tragic. But
Thank
if we
you.
look at the impact that terrorism had, even when it was at its worst to our country, if you go back to the 9/11 site, there's a new Freedom Tower, right? We rebuilt because we're very resilient. Why are we so resilient? We're resilient because we have free markets, we have freedom of the press, we have a democratic system, we have capitalism that allows us to respond quickly to tragedy. And all of these things help us be more sort of resilient. But if the government has too much information in its power and can secretly share that information with whoever it wants without checks and balances, we start to lose those free markets. We start to lose the competition that we have today that makes us so resilient. And if you look at the damage that terrorists have done in the past compared to you know, or even look at terrorism over the course of our country, like I would argue that the boogeyman of terrorists has been far more damaging than the terrorists themselves, even if you include the horrible tragedies of 9/11. And I would argue that giving up our freedoms for those because of the threat of terrorism is really not the right decision to make. And I would also further say that if you really want to understand why we had terrorists attacking our country on 9/11, watch the movie Charlie Wilson's War. It popularized what I had learned through research beforehand, but is now hopefully more common knowledge. And you'll better understand why having a more transparent government will prevent terrorists rather than the opposite. And what illegal spying, or not illegal, but legalizing spying on U.S. citizens doesn't create a more transparent government, it creates a less transparent one that has more power. So let's talk about PRISM, which was revealed by Edward Snowden. Basically, it included broad brushstroke data gathered from or sorry, a broad amount of data gathered related to foreign intelligence targets. It included email communication, full content and metadata, stored data files and cloud storage, video and voice chat, instant messaging and text messages, social media activity and connections, search histories and browsing data, location data, file transfers and downloads, contacts and address books. So under FISA, which basically allowed Section 702 of FISA allowed the NSA to target non-US people located outside of the US, but there was incidental collection of US citizens or people in the US, which was unavoidable because of the vast amount of data collection. And so that raised a lot more privacy concerns because you're talking about US citizens having this very detailed data collected on them. And again, like I think if it's solely for uh you know terrorist targets that are legitimate targets of terrorism, then maybe that makes sense. Maybe that is the price that we need to pay for keeping our country safe from terrorism. But I would argue that another approach would be instead of giving up our security to prevent terrorists, why don't we do things that uh, make it less likely that terrorists will be able to recruit more terrorists? And actually, I think I'm going to do another event now that I mention it. I have an essay that I'll turn into a presentation on combating terrorism, and I will try to try to put out there a solution because I'm a big believer in, don't point out a problem if you haven't also made a suggestion on a solution. And so I will try to point out a solution for how to combat terrorism without having to uh, be perpetually dependent on these types of uh, uh, surveillance. And I'm not saying that they don't make sense now. So, but I think that these types of things should be, time bound, if nothing else. And right now, there is no time bound. And I would argue we should probably have better methods of fighting terrorism than what we have today. And so that'll be the topic of the next event. So that said, the real question that I would ask is, in the interest of sort of stimulating conversation, is do we need to adapt the Fourth Amendment to include the digital age and maintain having some level of privacy as a fundamental right? Um, can we, if we do that, what I would recommend is adapt the Fourth Amendment to say that, search and seizure can only be done if it is um, for the purpose of following, uh, t terrorist suspects, and that there needs to be some, checks and balances to who gets called a terrorist. Because one of the things that I remember happening, there was a lot of dialogue about this years ago, was who gets to decide who's a terrorist, right? Like there's a lot of ambiguity in just saying the term terrorist. Who gets to decide whether someone's a terrorist or not? And the example I give, and this is a little bit tongue in cheek, but if you're looking at this from the other side of the pond as the British, and you go back to early America when the amendments were written, um, the revolutionary soldiers that formed, that basically had the U.S. Revolution against Britain were essentially terrorists, right? Like our founding fathers were part of armies that were terrorists of the time, and the hit and run tactics that we talk about in early American history were essentially, meant to, weave terror into the, often greater forces of the British Army. So that said, I think because of that, it's important that we define who and what a terrorist is a little bit more clearly. And then to say that, I think it's worth giving up a little bit of freedom to track those terrorists that, now we have a check and balance and a clear definition of who is a terrorist, what makes them a terrorist or a suspected terrorist. And then maybe we can have a little bit of leniency on the communications with said terrorists. But there should also be laws protecting people so that if information is captured about a U.S. citizen, then, like you shouldn't, there should be protections that keep people safe from unnecessary search and seizure that is not in the national security interest. So, um, I think it's important that and we talked a little bit about this in the social, that we hold the government accountable when we're talking about privacy rights. And I think it's important that we not be contradicting our own constitution with our laws, which we're doing today without having some sort of amendment to the Constitution saying search and seizure are okay under these specific situations. So that said, I'm going to open it up for questions, and I will ask people to limit each question or comment to one topic at a time, and try to limit it to less than 2 or 3 minutes per time that you raise your hand. And then after someone speaks or asks their question or makes their comment, I want this to be conversational. So I'm going to respond to everybody so that they feel heard and listened to, and so that it's not a disconnected conversation. But I want all of you to feel free to jump in whenever you hear a space, if you want to ask a thoughtful question to understand where someone's coming from, if they just made a comment or asked, if someone just made a comment, whether it's me or someone else. And then we sometimes have some back and forth dialogue between people who raise their hands. So with that said, I would love for people to raise your hands. If people have questions, would love to hear. Hopefully I was a little more balanced than people thought I was going to be, but I would welcome any comments or questions from anyone. Really, I nailed it, huh? I have all the answers. No, I don't have all the answers. Carly, I would love to hear from you.
That was a great presentation. I had a number of questions that popped up in my head. One of
Please.
which I don't know if it's the appropriate time to raise it right now, but is there a difference between freedom and privacy? I think of the oversight or kind of big brother actions that they may know and be gathering all my data, but am I still free to choose and free to be me, or free to run a
Mhm.
stop sign, or break certain laws, what have you? Or is it something that maybe there's a deeper level of what they're trying to get as far as profiles of people? I tend to think that if I don't participate in social media and post my goings on and give my whole lives and diary written out for anybody to read, does that make me more or less suspect? If I'm not doing that, am I somebody that has something to hide? Would that be, maybe impetus for people to look into my life more or not? Anyway, there are a number of questions I have about this. I'd love to hear what others have to say.
Those are great questions, Carly. I think you know, I don't know the answer as to whether or not if you're not as present on social media, whether or not, like, I think, like, does that make you more of a risk, etc. I hope that there's no one even thinking about that in the government, although I would argue there probably is someone thinking about it, because given all the stuff that has been leaked, that our government is doing, there's probably stuff they're doing that they shouldn't be thinking about. And I would argue that's one that they shouldn't be thinking about, in that if they don't already have a hot lead on someone that is a suspected terrorist, that hopefully would agree with the terms that most of us would use to describe a terrorist, then I would hope they shouldn't be thinking about that. But I will say, Carly, people are making those distinctions on a regular basis. I personally don't have my Facebook visible to people unless they know someone that I'm already friends with. So I'm not big on Instagram. So I think it's really a personal choice, but I think the best question you asked was, is there a difference between freedom and privacy? I would argue freedom is the freedom to do what you want to do. Privacy is what you can keep secret. And I think there is a difference there. But if your privacy, or if, let's put it this way, if the government was using lack of surveillance in the way that I mentioned in my second example, with corporations, then you're sort of limiting people's freedom by limiting their privacy, because you're limiting the competitive nature of commerce. So that's where it becomes really, really dangerous. And I would just love to see that we draw a line, because the slippery slope argument, we started out with just metadata surveillance, right? And then we got into like contents of emails and all that stuff that I read off. That's very detailed. Your whole browsing history of every website you've ever been to, right? If you happen to be talking unwittingly to a suspect in another country, all of this very personal information could be given to the government. And, you know, and so I have some cause for concern that there's no clear limitation and no clear lines being drawn, other than the fact that the clear line was the Fourth Amendment, and we've clearly drawn over it right now. So, um, does that make sense, Carly?
Mhm.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I'm wondering, like, is there any sort of repercussions on behavior one way or another? If the government were to observe people, do they act differently because of that? That could be positively or it might be negatively. Same thing for if anybody is being stalked or spied on, do they act differently because of that oversight or that intrusion of privacy? Anyway, there are more questions people want to talk, but thank you, Garrett.
Yeah, thank you. Um, and yeah, they definitely, people do act differently when they know. That's why they have the secrecy around warrants in the other FISA court that I was mentioning, because they don't want to let terrorists know that they're being, you don't have to notify the terrorists, hey, by the way, we're going to do a warrant on you, right? Like that kind of would not work out so well. So I get that, but I also think we need, and I'm not suggesting that we notify the terrorists that we're spying on them. But I also think that we need checks and balances to make sure that is not abused. And I don't think we have enough of those checks and balances in place. I don't think there's enough, and I'm going to make the bold claim that in the age of democracy of the internet, there's not enough. Uh, we have citizen juries on criminal trials. We could have, citizens get involved in other areas of oversight in government too. And I think that, that sort of thing would be appropriate in this type of situation. I think having some sort of citizen board of randomly selected citizens having to approve that the evidence is, clear that this person is likely to be a terrorist, or something like that, some sort of use modern tech. And our government is not the best at using modern tech. Let's face it, mostly, you know, old white men, not to, as my friend, one of my friend groups says, OWGs, old white guys. We're not such a tech savvy, country in terms of that type of stuff, but I think we would benefit from being more so. So I'm sorry, lots of hands up. So Yana, go ahead. Привет, как дела?
And you're mute. You're on mute, Yana.
Yeah, I was trying to unmute myself. For some reason, my picture disappeared, but I don't mind.
It did.
And I have as any good presentation, it raises more questions and comments. So far I have 4, but I will address one per time.
Thank you, Yana. I appreciate that.
Yes, yeah. So my first comment would be that I'm world traveler and I did not see any country, literally not even one country, who would hate United States as much as United States hates other country, or at least looks down. Because many countries in this world are at the level of medieval ages, and they're very happy. And for some reason, we look down at them. So Russia and China. In China, people have no clue how much they are hated by United States. They look up at the US. And same in Russia. Russia never, ever, ever kept any thoughts about attacking or bothering United States. And they look up. And they, in fact, they're all very curious to visit the US. And those who visited US, they love it even more. But not vice versa. Unless Americans go there, they visit the country, they're so embraced and so much loved that they begin to open the eyes. And the same expats in China, they're saying the truth, but it's very hard to find this information. So this is my first comment.
Thanks, Yana. I will tell you, I'm also a world traveler, and I meet a lot of people that hate the United States. Not huge numbers. I would argue I meet more people like you, Yana, that love the United States or at least like it. But ever since the Iraq War, like our reputation has really gone much lower than it was before that, from my experience, from my international travels. And I will also say that if you were a family member of someone that was tortured by a government put into place by the US in South America, probably you're not going to have a high opinion of the United States, right? And I wouldn't either. And I don't have a high opinion of the United States government, quite frankly, because it allows those things to go on and even perpetuates them because they seem to think that Machiavelli's The Prince is a manual instead of like a manual for consolidating power instead of a bad idea. But that said, I do respect your opinion, Yana, that I think a lot of people in China and Russia do look up to the US, and I think it's because of the freedom that we have, the economic success that we've had. But I also think that it's important to acknowledge all the bad things that the US has done. And I will agree with you, Yana, that I think the US likes to criticize others without pointing out our own flaws. I try not to follow that suit, Yana, as I hope you've been catching. I'm perfectly willing to criticize everybody for bad behavior, and I'm perfectly willing to praise everybody for good behavior. You know, I had a friend who was Singaporean in New York City who, when I criticized China, he goes, Garrett, do you realize the Chinese government was the single government that lifted the most people out of poverty in the last 20 years? And I fact checked that, and he was right. And I was like, oh, actually, for all the criticism we will do of the Chinese government, and I will criticize them for not having democratic elections, and I think they should, but I will also say they've done a lot of good for the Chinese population. That said, I think we have to recognize the good and acknowledge the bad. And like I said before, that's the only way we can improve on the bad.
Yep. Common sense, which is surprisingly very uncommon.
I know, right? Carl, go ahead. If no one has questions or comments for either me, John, or me.
Yeah, so I'll go backwards because what you said about the citizens panel idea.
Yeah.
It's sortition, by the way, because you could have citizen panels and citizen congress people and citizen senators, and you eliminate the professional politician. Anyway, so that was a pro for sortition, just FYI, because I know you're still against it, but
I don't know that I'm against it, Carl.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's the right long-term plan. But I would prefer sortition compared to like what we have today. Yes.
Yeah.
But I also don't want to throw the
Yeah.
baby out with the bathwater.
Maybe I meant not as passionate as you should be, only because when I heard the first time it came across my path through a TED Talk, I was like so passionate about it. I was like, oh my God, it answers 99% of what everybody hates about politics. And I was like, wow. And I couldn't find any negatives. But anyway, that's an aside. regarding the examples you gave about what could go wrong with that, as I was listening to that, because that was the one area where I was trying to be convinced that my position is, that I should care about privacy and surveillance. But it made me think of, well, yeah, if somebody like Kim Jong-un became president, then I would worry about it. And then I'm thinking, even then, or maybe even if, the guy who should remain nameless becomes president in a week, which he probably would, he would be the type to do that. I would still not care, only because I'm not the type that talks about politics online anyway. I don't post stuff about my thoughts or anything. So I'm thinking all the things that I'm being surveilled about, if it's the government surveilling me, they don't care about me. Like, I'm no threat, right? So I don't care. All the information that is online about me, about, like, the history of my browsing and all the things that people go, oh my God, it's so private, is commercial, meaning, like, the only people who care about that are the Googles and the Amazon and the Facebook, in order to create more and more detailed advertising, which personally I think is okay with me. I mean, I don't care, right? If it's something specifically that I'm looking for or that I need that I didn't even know about it, okay, I'll consider it. It doesn't mean that I will buy it, but at least, I have nothing against carefully targeted advertising personally. And that's really the only thing about the privacy thing that I'm worried about. Now, unless, I was watching this movie the other day, which was about a serial killer, and I was thinking, okay, if I were a serial killer, I would know that I would have to be careful about privacy, and therefore I would try to make, all the things. But other than that, if you're an average citizen, law-abiding citizen, you have nothing to hide, and you get all the benefits of the surveillance in a sense, because I think the big pro of surveillance is that we haven't had a terrorist attack since 2001. And it's something that I've always really worried about, because it's such a free, open country, that I was like, how could we stop the next person going into with a bomb on the subway or something? And that really terrified me. And I'm realizing, well, that hasn't happened. And I'm thinking maybe it's because we've had that extra surveillance and we've caught people before it even happened. So I think maybe that's a positive all along. But I'm still open to have my mind changed about it.
So let me
Thank you.
let me make a shot at doing
Yeah.
that. So sure, you're safe, Carl, but what about other people who share their political backgrounds on social media? And what about the scenario that I gave about a company being, a company that might be a more innovative and capable company being put out of business because, you know, of, you know, corporate or government sanctioned corporate espionage? Wouldn't that be
Right.
a problem? And then the other thing that I'll say is, well, what if let's say things, we had a violent coup attempt in our January 6th.
Thanks. Yeah.
So what if suppose Trump does take power and he decides that he wants to release information about people who were anti-Trump to people who are, mentally unstable Trump supporters with guns,
Yeah.
in their neighborhood. Hey, here's a target for
Yeah.
you, right? What if that happened? Would you still think that that's okay? Is the government surveillance still okay if it was used for that purpose?
Yeah.
And, if you look at who Trump is recruiting, he's recruiting loyalists. He's
Yeah.
recruiting people loyal to Trump. And the
Yeah.
only reason that the other two attempts to prevent a peaceful transition of power didn't work is because there were people who were more loyal to the country than they were to Trump. And
Yeah.
without those checks and balances, if Trump takes power, the
Hmm.
chances are good, Trump could have a lot of influence, a lot
Yeah.
more than any president has ever had since the founding
Yeah.
of the country. I'm going to put it that way.
Yeah.
And so, would
But
that change your opinion?
uh, it wouldn't, for one reason, and I'll tell you why. Because I've thought about this. I have thought about, okay, what happens if, when Trump Actually, I thought about it in 2016. So we've had already a rehearsal already of what could happen. And here's the one thing that I think gave me hope. Even though half, and I'm sorry for being direct, but even though half the country are morons for voting for Trump, I'll say that.
Those are your
Um,
words, not mine.
yeah, that's fine. And if the government is listening, I don't care. But um,
But now you're not safe anymore, Carl.
no, but still, I still think I'm safe, and I'll tell you
Go ahead.
why. In response to what you just said, um, I still think that more than half the people are faking it. And by faking it, I mean, and this is why it made me think that there's some truth to what I'm saying. When Trump was in power, there were still a lot of people who kind of knew the reality of everything. I forget what it was called. There was articles about it. I don't know if it was the deep state or something. Like within every part of government, there were people who were rational enough and smart enough to know what an idiot he was and to kind of like massage it in a sense so it wouldn't get there. Now, I agree about this idea that I think he's learned that and he's trying to get the loyalists and Project 25 and the judges and all that stuff. That is kind of scary, but I still think that there's a lot more people who say they're loyalists and are hired to be in his team, but secretly they're rational and human enough to know better. Does that make sense? Like I really think that that's the case, right?
So you're saying
Yeah.
that the people that Trump is recruiting that are asked like who are your primary political inspirations, and they're choosing 95% of people who say Trump is my political inspiration, those people are gonna say, you know what? I think Trump may be in the wrong here. I'm not gonna back him. Is that your perspective?
No, I think my perspective is like I'm bringing I just thought of Tucker Carlson. It's a perfect example. Tucker Carlson is somebody who we know exactly what he really believes, right? And I'm not saying he's a perfect human being, but he's the one that was on record saying what an idiot Trump was, and now he's there, on his side championing. So I don't know how that happens, or the Ted Cruz of this world,
Oh, I
whatever.
see what you're
I
saying.
think there's
So you're
enough.
saying half of, okay. Yeah, I see
Yeah,
what you're saying. Look, I hope that's the case. I
yeah.
hope that's the case.
I think there's enough evidence for that. I'm not saying it's 100%, but I still think Mike Pence is a perfect example of this. Like I thought, oh my God, Mike Pence is, I had all these negatives, but the fact that he stood up on January 6th kind of gave me a little respect, and the fact that, okay, he knew better. And I think that there's a lot of people within the Republican Party who are still in control in positions, even in the Supreme Court, believe it or not, who are a little more rational than they appear to be, even though they're on the right side, if that makes sense. I think when comes push to shove, they do the right thing. And
Well,
that's my
I
hope.
will say that, when push came to shove, Mike Pence did the right thing, and so that does give me hope, and I hope, and I feel bad for Mike Pence because he got so many death threats for certifying that the election was valid, but I think
Yeah,
that was the right decision. There wasn't really evidence, and that's why it was thrown out by all the courts that the election wasn't valid. So
yeah.
I hope you're right, but I do want to pick a nit with you, which is there have been a lot of terrorist events since 9/11. The 2009 Fort Hood shooting, the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, the 2015 San Bernardino attack, the
Mm.
2016 Orlando nightclub shooting, the 17 Vegas shooting, the 18 Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, the 19 El Paso Walmart shooting, the 22 Buffalo
Oh,
supermarket shooting. So
yeah, yeah. Okay. Are but you're talking about domestic and like mass
that was
shootings.
a mix. There was a
Okay.
mix. So
I was thinking more like Islamic, like kind of
the
like on the scale of
the Pulse
2000.
nightclub was ISIS inspired. The
Okay.
2015 San Bernardino attack was ISIS inspired.
Okay.
Um, the
Okay. Fair enough.
2013 Boston
Yeah.
Marathon was extremism inspired, and the Fort Hood shooting. I don't know why that's a tongue twister for me. The responsible individual cited jihadist motivations. So
Okay.
all
Okay.
of those were actually Middle Eastern uh,
Right.
inspired shootings. So we're not
Okay.
quite as safe as we think. But what I will say is, none of them were as bad as 9/11. That's true. But 9/11 was also the most deaths on US soil since the beginning of the country, other than our Civil War, right? So,
And
um,
also, I mean, 9/11 was a a period of time where there was basically no security, or we took a lot of stuff for granted. And I
right.
think, obviously, events, we learn from them and we make laws and things because of the events, and then we become more secure. I think that's what 9/11 did. Um, and so, yeah, even though there's still some cracks, I still feel that we're more secure than before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not saying that any of the surveillance that we know about is wrong or that it should be done away with, right? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we should draw a line that what we're doing now is the most we should do, and we should create an amendment to justify it under that pretense and say no more, right?
Yeah.
And say, look, we're gonna be consistent with ourselves, be consistent with our Constitution. We're gonna say the surveillance we're doing now is okay and no more
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, fair enough.
without another amendment. So thank you, Carl. David.
I'm sorry for not cutting the
Oh, I'm sorry.
tomato.
Go ahead. Jump in.
Done it this morning,
It's
but I
okay.
didn't know that they were ripe.
Let's talk later.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. I thought that was someone trying to jump in. So I think that was a side conversation.
Yeah.
Go ahead, David. I would love people to jump in. I don't want it to just be me talking with everybody. I would love for people to jump in. And I'm sure some of you have thoughts on your mind. And if you have a question or like a comment that you want to make, I bet someone else has the same question in any given room. Whatever question you have, I'll guarantee someone else has the same question. So feel free to ask follow-up questions yourselves. David, go ahead.
I think what Carl is relying on is reasonable people. But the trouble is, China and Russia are full of reasonable people, but they're, a a subset, if the conditions are right, can take control of the majority of reasonable people and do very unreasonable things. So to support your argument, Garrett, perhaps the slide or the, I told you the continuum, excuse me, in the when we were talking earlier in the opening, that, it's a continuum between privacy and security. And you're suggesting perhaps we should have more towards the privacy, because otherwise a minority group or an unreasonable group of people can use the lack of laws, the lack of oversight to bring in a system whereby they could become more powerful and run the show against the majority of reasonable people. So that's, I think democracy is a very interesting experiment. I'm not sure it's successful in the long run. I think, because it's so open, which is, I think Carl mentioned, or maybe you mentioned, Garrett, it is a very open society, amazingly open. And it is amazing that more terrorist activity hasn't occurred. And those activities that you mentioned, Garrett, in 2013, they were maybe inspired, but they were like crazy people inspired by crazy stuff. I'm not sure that they were, direct, like ISIS directly involved in what happened. Maybe they were, but I didn't get that impression. I got the impression these were kind of loners, who pick on a particular idea and run with it and then say, well, I did it because, I'm pro ISIS and, these Americans got to die. Like, this is an American talking, I'm saying, whoever was shooting people in wherever it was, the nightclubs that you were talking about. Anyway, my main point is relying on reasonable people doesn't always work. And so it's sort of it's a subtle combination of having institutions that are protecting human rights and individual rights, but on the other hand, allowing government whom you would hope would be defending you and making sure that bombers aren't on the subways when you're going to work and things like that. That's what you want the government to do. The big stuff that we can't do individually, and that requires a lot of intelligence and a lot of networks. So you want to have them doing this stuff, but on the other hand, you don't want some sort of a system whereby a small group of people can gather gain the reins of power and lord it over the reasonable majority, like what happens in China and Russia and who knows, even North Korea. I would argue most of the people there are reasonable people, but they're living under a very unreasonable system run by unreasonable, power hungry people. So I don't have anything clear to say. Sorry, that's it for me.
No, so just so you know, I did check the at least the Fort Hood shooting. The guy was in talks with a radical cleric with ties to Al Qaeda. So he did have specific ties to Al Qaeda.
But he wasn't like somebody who grew up in the Al Qaeda family and then came over to the States and started doing what there's a lot
of. Can I clarify something really quickly? Can I clarify this? Because I don't think people understand. There are 3 lands in Islam. One of them was granted under Surah 2, Chapter 40. The land of Israel was granted by Allah to the Jews. The second land is Dar al-Islam, the lands of Islam. Dar al-Arab, Harab means the land of war. You all live in the lands of war. In case you are unaware of this, their war will continue until all of you are following Islam. And that is the stated goal of Islam. And they have coercive efforts going on randomly by
hang on
all the time, forever, until the end of time. Unless you eliminate them or they reform, as Ollie Hersey has pointed out, or Hersey has pointed out.
Do you have friends that are Muslim?
I do, actually. So a Kurdish friend of mine, Ho Shang, and I've almost dated a girl from Azerbaijan. I've actually studied, in case anybody hadn't noticed all these books behind me, they're all on religion. It's my specialty. I am not anti-Muslim. I'm warning you that their goal is to take over everybody, and anytime any cult reaches a saturation level, it forces its will upon others. Bibi in Israel would like to make everybody Jewish and only Jews would have rights, and that's the way they would like to have it. Once they get, any cult gets a certain amount of saturation level. Paris, France is a good example. And St.
Trask, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you want to make a longer than 20-second comment.
That was the original trying rules. To. I am just so go read Ollie Hersey's book, Prey and Heretic.
I would encourage you to have conversations with moderate Muslims, because what you're talking about seems to be the extremist Muslim perspective, not at all the moderate perspective of friends of mine that are followers of Islam. So that said, I know you're the religious expert, and you're going to probably believe you're right, even though
the vast majority of Muslims are reasonable people, like the vast majority of Christians, Jews, Buddhists. Like that's the thing that we count on, is the fact that the vast majority of humans are reasonable. Otherwise, we've got no hope. So, that's the bottom line, I would say.
Right, and they are coerced to participate in the systems that are in control. Whether those controls happen to be your local government or a religious body that is also possibly in control with the government.
Yeah, well, that's what I was talking about that's what I was talking about. If you listen to me, when I was saying that minorities who are unreasonable, if the situation is right, they can gain control over the reasonable majority. That's what I was talking about. It doesn't have to be Islam. It could be any group, like in North Korea. There's no religious content, as far as I know, to the autocracy they have there. It's just it's the situation allowed a minority of unreasonable people to be dominating the majority, who I believe are probably very reasonable people, like everywhere in the world.
Yeah, agreed. So that said, let's go to Mike's hand up.
Actually, I don't want to say anything.
Okay. Did we scare you away, Mike? Are you sure?
No, I just want to listen right now. I mean, okay, I'll just be quiet. Thank you.
No problem. So Michael, go ahead.
Okay, I'd just like to bring up something that I think is kind of parallel about the empowerment of government to do as it will without guardrails, and that's the rule about asset seizure. The the Supreme Court ruled was okay if you're walking around with a large stack of bills and a police officer, FBI agent, whatever, thinks that you might have gotten this money by selling drugs, they can seize it from you without any court approval, without any charges whatsoever. And then to get the money back, you have to prove that you're not a drug dealer. And that's one example of the government, of why I think this is a slippery slope. Because if the government is given that kind of power to do this, and they're given the power to spy on us, it could go to extreme levels.
First of all, how many people in today are working with cash in their pocket? I mean, really? Still?
Oh yeah.
I haven't had cash for years. I mean, everything is like, you know,
I
my watch, my my phone.
I've read stories. I read a story about a guy who was moving to California to start his music business. He had $6K in cash.
Okay.
The police questioned him for some reason. They took the $6K away from him without any charges whatsoever. And I've read numerous cases like this. And also, I read that there are people going around giving continuing education lectures to law enforcement about how to use this to enrich the coffers of their jurisdictions.
That seems so unreasonable to me.
It is unreasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Asset seizure is totally unreasonable.
And you
Yeah,
can't.
but I wonder if there's more to it. This seems too blatant. I think there must be more subtleties involved in what you're talking about, Michael.
I mean, can't you go back to the police department and say, hey, I mean, this was taken from me. I'm not guilty of anything. Please give it back to me.
You have to prove it in court.
Yeah, well, maybe if you had a record and you're walking around with $6,000 in your pocket and you've got a drug dealing record, you know, you can see where the police might think that perhaps that 6,000 it wasn't legitimately gained. You know, there's a whole bunch of, I mean, just to say that, you know, the government's going around taking people's stuff.
Yeah, I would, Michael, if you can put a, can
There
you
was
put a
a,
link to the,
let me see if I can find
yeah, look
Yeah.
for a link to a source for that one.
Because we still live in a country
there
where
As a
was
former
something
deputy to
said
the
on-
office of sheriff of McIntosh County, Georgia, I can tell you that we pull people over and we will count the pills. So if you have used too many pills in your dose of hydrocodone, we will say that you're a drug dealer. We will confiscate your pills. We will throw you into jail, and you don't get out until you get to your Monday morning court if you got picked up on the weekend, or the next day if you're lucky and you got picked up on a weekday.
And if
They
you're,
can do
you
this.
know, and that includes people who are like 80 and staggering along with a lot of pain, I'm sure.
Oh,
you know, I mean,
absolutely. I saw a
you know,
woman
come
who
on.
needed it for
Let's,
sure.
let's
and I
not
had
get
to
too
process it.
extreme here. Let's try to
There
keep.
was one thing. Can I just say something? There was one thing I heard on the radio on the World Service that was about confiscated Russian assets, and I think Europe or NATO or whatever are using the interest on confiscated Russian assets to send arms to Ukraine.
Yeah.
And there was a thing
That seems
there was a-
very reasonable to me.
Yeah, but there was a thing on the radio that was like they interviewed someone. It was almost like a Swiss banker or someone who was like, "Yeah, this isn't the way it's done." And then suddenly they interviewed someone else who was like, "Yeah, actually, it's fine." I mean, but it's one of those things that it's one of those international law things that it is kind of it's the way the world works. You know, that's not sportsmanlike. But in this case, it is. I just found that interesting because I'm not a money man. I'm not an economist, but like I just found that interesting. Like because where it comes down to the wire is money, isn't it? Like
Yeah, but this even has this edge of poetic justice to me.
Yeah, and I mean, at the moment, one of the good things I think, in a weird way, is that all the bad guys are basically gangsters. Like Putin's a gangster.
Mhm.
He's not an ideologue at all. Trump's a gangster. Who else? Kind of Kim Jong Un's a bit weird, but like he's not an ideologue, is he? You know.
Charles,
So,
if I could ask you, just hang on just one where we got
sorry.
one more person in front of you. That's okay. Happy to have people chime in, but keep it on topic and then to 20 seconds. No, you're welcome. Keep your hand up, Charles. I still want to hear from you. I think your hand went down because you spoke. But put it back up. Yeah, thanks. Yana, go ahead. Привет.
Thank you. So a lot of interesting things was said, especially that most people in the world are reasonable, and a few other stuff. I just don't want to repeat. Oh, and by the way, thank you. I learned a lot about the presumption of innocence is violated in this country. I never thought about it, actually. So thank you for bringing it up. However, my comment about reputation of United States is a little different. Not even one country looks at the US as a country of freedom. Not even one. Uniform opinion about the US that it's full of bags with cash. And this is the opportunity to keep begging United States to share this cash. So I stopped even saying that I live in California, especially Santa Barbara, and I just keep saying that I'm from Russia. And attitudes so totally different, especially in countries like China or Argentina. Otherwise, they would immediately ask me for money. And those who knew that I'm from US, like Bhutan or what was recent, whatever, they immediately, Bhutan, Nepal, few other countries that are like a medieval level of lifestyle, they immediately ask you for donations. And those donations are big. They don't ask you for $5. They ask you to build the new bathrooms for the boys' monastery. They ask you to help them to repair the house. So it's not like they're satisfied with a few dollars. And again, they look at the US only from the economical point of view. And if somebody visited China within last few years, which I came back from China last visit 3 months ago, I could not believe it. There is no way, absolutely no way in the world that US will ever catch up with China. And their politics changed, political economical course. They gave up already production of cheap goods. And they are right now towards the course of production of very high quality and sovereignty in a political economical way. And they don't really worry much about the relationship with the US. But again, like I said, majority of people have no idea how much they are hated. And microchips already almost caught up with Taiwan. Like Taiwan now, it's 2 nanometers and Chinese 3 nanometers, and they are working towards 2. So, but I will finish here because I still have 4 more questions, comments, but they're less important, I think.
May I just react to Garrett to what you just said
Yeah, go
about
ahead.
China? Just very quickly. There's one thing I must tell you from what I've read. I would never eat anything that was coming out of China in terms of food.
That's
I've
your
read
loss. Because
I've read too many
very
articles
big
about
loss,
all the horrible chemicals that they use in their food for their own country's consumption, as well as the food that is exported. to other countries. That's just me.
But your point is very well taken, because only bad quality cheap stuff comes to the United States. When you go there, every single person mentions and food. So there is plenty of organic, very fresh. Food is very fresh, except maybe you buy them on the street or a cheap store with artificial dyes, but nobody eats that junk. They all go to the best restaurants, which for US $3 equivalent, you can have 3-course meal, and everything will be cooked in front of you from fresh ingredients. And diversity of food is just difficult to imagine even. And there is no such things like the Panda Express or whatever we have here. Here is like different fried junk. But
there are definitely, I gotta fact check you here on a bunch of areas, Yana. There are definitely McDonald's and other fast food locations in China. Organic produce is under 3% of China's total agricultural land. And there are definitely lots of people that I've met abroad that look at the US as a place of freedom. You covered a lot of topics, so I'm trying to hit them all. I hope you don't really think that literally no one on earth thinks of the US as a place of freedom. And then as for the US catching up to China, that's a different question. In some areas, maybe we will. In other areas, maybe we won't. In some areas, they're still catching up with us. And I agree with you that they're producing high quality, complicated goods.
Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I had to mute because my daughters kept yelling at me.
Oh, I thought that you were talking with us.
Sorry. And then as far as not worrying much about the relationship with the US, between 15 and 18% of their exports go to the US. So they do care a little bit. It's a big, it's a very big percentage, probably the largest. Does China have any
And
large,
mostly cheap stuff is coming here because it's cheap.
like iPhones?
It's mostly production. It's manufacturing, but
Yana, everything comes here. Solar panels come here, like everything, like across the entire technological spectrum comes to the US. Like almost everything we buy is like half of it is made in China.
There's all levels of quality from
yeah, cheap stuff is coming, but electrical vehicles are not going to come here because they see electrical vehicles as a spying devices. And the same with China, they will stop buying American-made vehicles. So we will not see very high quality Chinese vehicles. Like they're like literally superb within last couple years. And very soon they will wrap up that production of electronics. They will not do it for the US. And we will see less and less, expensive stuff. So if it will be manufactured in the US, our cell phones would be $5,000. Who will be able to afford it? Like it was like the biggest mistake of Trump was ruining relationship with China, in my opinion. But anyway, I don't want to take more time.
Yeah, so I would argue that what's happening with China is actually the way that it's supposed to work with international trade. You take a country that doesn't have a lot of money. You leverage the low cost of labor to produce a lot of goods, and then that country moves up the technology chain so that they use higher and higher skilled labor to create more complicated things. And if they're smart, they'll also form more of a services industry, although they haven't felt the need to. So that's not their focus. It's mostly on production of physical goods. But then China will, as it gets wealthier and wealthier, become a consumer of US products, right? More than an exporter to the US. They'll be buying things from the US and they'll be a customer of ours. So that's actually how international trade is supposed to work when you don't put up big trade barriers. And what it does is it creates a wealthier world for everybody. Now, the only complication with China is that a lot of that wealth is in the hands of the government, and there's not democracy there. So now a lot of that wealth is going into the military, and it's potentially going against U.S. interests because the U.S. is supportive of Taiwan and China wants to take over Taiwan. So that's another story for another day. But the way that things are playing out that you're describing, Yana, is very much the way that international trade is supposed to go when it's done right. And I would say the Chinese government is doing the right thing in terms of leading themselves up the tech ladder. So I hope more countries will continue to do that as well that are currently low cost sources of labor, but I hope eventually will be customers of US goods and services. Charles, go ahead.
Oh God. I was gonna say, okay. I was gonna say, what do you think the world would have been like if we hadn't done the if Babbage hadn't done the computer? Would it be kind of the same but a bit faster? But actually what I'm gonna say is, like, I think weirdly, like, box shipping and cheap flights are the best things that humans have ever invented, with like probably like no, like, I'm not joking, like, you know, with proper engineering, proper capitalism, proper customer kind of awareness. For somehow we've managed to utilize what we've got. So you can fly wherever you want, basically, and you can ship whatever you want to make to other places, give or take. And that's absolutely extraordinary. Like, that is absolutely, like, crazy, like, extraordinary. And obviously it's going to go wrong. But at the moment, America and China, as a sort of opposing forces, are kind of bringing themselves into flux with each other. No, into balance with each other, because of just this sheer amount of trade, which, you know, no one can really stop. Doesn't matter whether you're president or, you know, it's going to happen unless, you know, unless global warming gets really, really bad. But, you know, that's going to, like, it's all going to balance out. So I'm trying to be positive here. Yeah, I had like a million other points. It's such an interesting discussion, but I'll leave it there.
Cool.
A vaguely positive one.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Like, you know, the inventions of the, you know, modern travel capabilities are very impressive, and shipping capabilities are very impressive. We saw how they got stalled in the coronavirus pandemic, but interesting. But basically, yeah, I would agree with you that those are very impressive, and I don't know what the world would have looked like if Babbage hadn't invented the Babbage machine, but you know, hopefully we would have invented computers another way. But
there was one. I was going to say one just very quick thing. I'm working in hospitality at the moment, and in London, so it's that very multicultural, you know. Play someone from a different country every single time you talk to someone, and a lot of people still think that England is brilliant. Do you know what I mean? Absolutely brilliant, like law and order, kind of rich, but not, you know, not showy, whatever. Do you mean, like, kind of and it always gets me. I'm very proud, actually. But it always gets me. There's, like, you know, there's a thing about, like, our colonial past, which is, like, awful. Do you mean? But for some reason, this country kind of works. And even when you've got a sort of psychopath like Boris, again, not to get too, you know, Boris in charge, he's just, like, pushed out by even older, even more psychopathic men who have just ever existed since the beginning of time for 1,000 years. And to be honest, I would say that your senators should do a bit more of that, because all of your senators are like 90 years old, aren't they? Like all of our lords are.
Yeah.
So they should do a little bit more of, like,
Congress people.
Yeah, they should just use their just, like, sheer age, just to push out the sort of pretenders, the sort of psychos, basically, whoever they may be. Anyway, I'm kind of joking, but that's it. Cheers.
Oh, don't joke. I mean, I think we need term limits on these guys. We Bernie Sanders and Mitch McConnell all started in the 1970s. That's a pretty
Yeah,
long period of time to be hanging out in the office and in extreme levels of power.
yeah, and I think there's no real reason why we're different for hang on why the sort of British old people are different from the American old people. I think we just have we're just much poorer, and we've got this sort of false confidence about being 1,000 years old, which kind of works in tandem, which makes us kind of less threatening. Obviously, and we haven't got as many like ships and guns and stuff. Anyway, anyway, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks for staying up so late for us, Charles. I appreciate that. It's good to have you here and fellow
No,
hospitality guy. So
it's a fantastic discussion, and it's wonderful to have an introductory speech by you. Do you mean, Garrett?
thanks.
Yeah.
We have different people present, but I'm usually the presenter of last resort. If we don't have someone else, then it's me. So Michael,
Wow,
you're screen sharing. I don't
brilliant.
know if you mean to be. I'm gonna take over. I don't think he meant to screen share. Yana, you have your hand up.
I would like to proceed to my next topics, but every time when you speak, I have more questions and more comments.
That's okay. That's what life's about, is asking thoughtful questions. And so
I just
go
can't
for it.
move on to other topics. And literally like 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, China could be still considered poor country, despite it was not poor at that time yet. But in my opinion, not only mine, like world economists consider that purchasing power is more important than bulk GDP. And from this prospect, some countries can live on $1 per month, literally, and live very well. But by the equivalent of $1, we consider, oh, let's just look down on them. So again, back to China, it's very wealthy country. And it has absolutely zero intentions to attack United States or NATO, in fact. The main goal is to improve trades. And it continues to spend their money now on infrastructure. And I hope everyone knows at least that fact. They have a lot of money, and their government is very careful how it's investing. Like they invested enormous amount in Tibet. And I visited random villages, and I was thinking, oh, it cannot be private house. It's probably like little hotel or at least like bed and breakfast. They say, no, it's a private house, 3-story buildings with a courtyard. And government gives not only money, they give you architect, and they build houses for those remote villagers as long as they are farming land. So they give them land, which is not easy, even if it is a Tibetan prefecture, which is much wealthier than Tibet autonomous, because they kind of just left Tibet autonomous alone. But before leaving alone, they built amazing infrastructure in Tibet.
Why do you think China left Tibet alone?
Because all these disputes that Tibet, I consider also Tibet is kind of like a separate country, but they should not be so negative toward China, because Mao Zedong died 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago. And since that time, they turned 180 degrees into opposite direction, not even talking that they punished severely everyone who was a Mao Zedong representative. So, but we still go back, oh yes, Mao Zedong, poor country, communism, they killed all monks. No, they restored all monasteries. They encourage monkhood especially in Tibet, but everywhere where cities are ancient, like the amount of temples and churches somebody mentioned here is unbelievable.
Yeah, I'm
They
sure
have
there's lots of progress in China. I've definitely seen it myself. There are more skyscrapers in Shanghai than there were in New York, even in like 2005, and it's only gone probably 10x more than that, more than 10x than that since. But you're a little bit off on Tibet policy from China. Since China invaded Tibet in the 50s, they've encouraged the Han Chinese, the native to China, the sort of group native to China, to go into Tibet in order to take it over demographically, and they've also and so that's probably where you saw no, ahora no, princesa, no puedo. So that's probably why you saw the really nice houses, because it was China, building inexpensive housing for Han Chinese to immigrate to Tibet, which is part of the cultural assimilation and religious control that China has implemented over Tibet. They've also taken control over resources, exploited resources, basically, like copper, gold, and lithium, to fuel the Chinese economy, even to the detriment of the environment in Tibet. So there's a lot more going on in Tibet than what you were saying, and quite to the contrary of what you were saying. Sorry to contradict you, Yana, but I like to say the truth bends its will to no person, and the truth is eternal, whether we like it or not. It's going to be the truth either way.
Han could not sustain their life in Tibet. Babies were dying. People were becoming very sick. Tibet is very, very, very high altitude. It's the highest country in the world. The whole population of Tibet is 6 million people, and they're mostly Tibetans, a few other minorities. But Han absolutely refused to go to live in Tibet, because the original Mao Zedong plan was to move 50 million there, and just people kept dying, and babies were never born. So Chinese refused to go there. There is not much resources. It's mostly desert. It's very desolate, huge, huge desert, high elevation desert. And there is very little resources there. I didn't see even one mining. The mining there is mostly for cement.
How many mines have you seen in the US?
Oh, gazillion. We have a lot of resources here.
No, how many have you seen specifically, physically?
Oh, yeah, I've seen quite a few. Yeah, like copper,
That's funny.
for
I've lived here
example.
my whole life. I don't even know that I've seen more than one mine in my entire life.
Oh, no, you travel probably through US. You can see
I travel
mines.
all the time, Yana, but you don't see mines when you travel. I really recommend looking it up. You can Google it, Yana. Everything that I just said about China and Tibet is very much fact. And actually, like I think you need to do a little bit more researching about the relationship with Tibet and China. If China
Oh,
was
yeah,
doing
I
Tibet
know a
such a
lot.
favor,
Thank you for
China would
advice.
not have had to invade militarily in the 50s. I think it was in 1950. They would have just asked Tibet to join China, and if Tibet had wanted to, they would have said yes. But that's not how it went down. What happened is China invaded Tibet and said, "You will be a part of us, whether you like it or not." And the Dalai Lama had to flee. Not only that, but the young boy who was, I think, five or six at the time that he was chosen, that was supposed to choose the next Dalai Lama, was kidnapped by the Chinese government to try to prevent Buddhism from continuing down the lineage of 1,000 years of Dalai Lamas, essentially. And maybe I forget exactly how long the Dalai Lama goes back in Tibet, but it's a long lineage. And China essentially changed that tradition that has gone on for many, many centuries. So there's a lot of wrongdoing that China has done in Tibet by taking it over in the first place, and then there's a lot of wrongdoing that they've done since then. We could have a whole event on China and Tibet and
Yeah,
how
I agree
bad.
with you, Garrett.
Yeah.
I agree with what you said, Garrett.
Yeah, because that's what we know, what was going on in 70 years ago or whatever, 70 plus. And it's time to learn more about modern country, which it tries to isolate Tibet as much as they can. And I consider Tibet separate country. And especially because I know quite a bit of history, especially Tibet and China, quite a bit. And but again, it's separate topic. When Tibet was so huge and powerful that it actually took huge part of China in the past, but it wasn't, I think, like 16th century. We never talk about Mongolia was taking Tibet and actually not taken militarily. They just wanted to be friends. But they had huge control over Tibet. We never talk about those things. And now I'm learning a lot about Tibet relationship with China. And I see more and more and more separation, maybe not political separation, but more and more and more. And actually, Chinese even try to bring soil there and water in order to create forests. It looks a little bit miserable, to be honest with you, because again, like I said, it's a desert and it's very, very isolated and huge. So, but hopefully they will succeed because the roads and tunnels are like crazy amazing. They're just in perfect condition, and only electrical vehicles are allowed to go to the Everest area. You're not allowed to use combustion vehicles at all. And plus, if you travel to Tibet, there is so many limitations. It's like you have to have separate visa. You're not allowed to travel alone. So they're very, very, very different from
You know why
mainland.
that is?
They're not allowed to talk politics, by the way, in Tibet, but everybody's talking politics.
Yeah, do you know why it's so difficult to get into Tibet?
I thought because they don't want people to either spread political information or to be lost because it's very, very dangerous there.
Spread
You just
political
die.
information?
Yes, they told
Is it
us right
dangerous?
away.
Do you think it's dangerous to spread political information, Yana?
You know, if it is truthful information, it's good, but if it is propaganda, it's not. It's just not helpful. But everyone was talking politics there anyway. They told us we are not
Yana, are you
allowed.
against free speech?
Oh, that's one of my questions. I don't think we should change First Commandment because everything will go off hands. Just like we legalized marijuana
Do you think there should be free speech in Tibet?
I don't see the point of discussion because no one really cares.
I care.
Like I told you, we talk
Does
about
anyone want to raise their
politics.
hand if they care whether or not there's free speech in Tibet, or like put a little heart if put a little react with a heart if you want free speech in Tibet.
Yeah. I would just say, hang on, like I don't want to get when England invades somewhere, we don't like them saying England isn't good. So before we start putting hearts everywhere, like just anyway.
I agree with you, Charles, but that's why I don't think anyone should be invading, and I don't think that China should have invaded Tibet at all. You know, Tibet has been pretty much its own thing ever since what was it, the 7th to 9th century Tibetan Empire. They've had their own distinct culture. Trying to assimilate them into China just because at one point it was part of the Chinese Empire doesn't necessarily make sense. That would be like, Charles, you saying that we should take back all of the colonial power, the places that when the sun never set on the English Empire, that England should suddenly go around and start reconquering those lost territories like America, for example.
I know. No. All I'm saying is that what I understood Yana was saying was it's possibly changed from the from 70 years ago. So there could have been, again, this goes back to sort of small groups of people being led by different people doing different things.
Yes.
Which sounds twee, but it's kind of true.
No, it goes exactly what you're saying, Charles.
Before you say, sorry, all I'm saying is before you say, do you believe in free speech? I mean, that's a kind of like end game thing to say. Sorry, again, I'm just an Englishman in New York.
Are you in New York, Charles?
No, I'm in Watford, like just north of London.
Okay, I was like, wait,
You're
I
in
thought you said you were in
London
London. So
still, right?
That was like a spazzy lyric from a Sting song, from a police song.
okay, my bad. Sorry.
Yeah, but thank you for saying that. Yeah, because we cannot just go back and back and back in the history. It will be almost 100 years when those things happen. So we have to move on. Mao Zedong was a bad call, but he achieved a lot of things. And there are some areas, like in Yunnan province, you cannot talk badly about Mao Zedong. And they still have their statues and portraits, but nobody cares. In Tibet, nobody cares to talk about how bad China is. It happened naturally. Han cannot live there. They just can't. They're not designed. Tibetans are designed, and native Tibetans are only 3 million. Other people, it's just minorities. It's not Han. I didn't see any Hans there. It's just different minority who are mostly like from Yunnan province and more southern, and there is a diversity, and they're mostly farmers.
Yana, I would recommend looking up objective sources about whether or not the Han are encouraged by the Chinese government to move to Tibet, because that is a well-known fact that I've known for quite some time. So I don't, and I fact-checked myself to make sure that it was still true, and it does still seem to be true. So it's kind of common knowledge, Yana. Like you said, you know a lot about Tibetan history, but you gotta look for sources that are not from the Chinese government, or even the Chinese government would probably admit that they're doing that, to be honest. So I would love to know what your source is that says other than that. Because all the sources I've ever looked at and all the people I've ever talked to, including people I know that lived in China for a decade, they all say the same thing. And so you're the only person telling me anything different than that.
Right, because I'm trying to update my knowledge about Tibet and other countries.
Cool.
Why I talk so much about China? Because I'm sick and tired about that hatred towards the rest of the world that we have here. And I do not consider it a free speech. I consider it a hate speech, because how many people, especially Americans, visited Tibet?
What do you think is hate speech, Yana?
I don't feel like we're a hate group here. I think
Oh,
like there's
yes,
a lot
we
of...
hate many countries, and now
No,
we
I
hate...
don't.
Oh, okay, yeah, all right, okay.
So
We have
Yana,
difference of
I love
opinion.
China. I love China. I love all the Chinese people I've known, not all, but like the vast majority of Chinese people I've known, I've gotten along really well with, and I thought were great people, both in China, in the US, like throughout my career. I love Chinese culture. I eat better with chopsticks than the vast majority of people that I know.
I'm
And
proud of you.
I
I'm
cook
proud.
Chinese food, like I use Chinese seasonings. Like I'm very into Chinese culture and I love China, but I love the Chinese people more than the Chinese government. I think that the Chinese people should be allowed to choose their own government because they want to, and that's demonstrated by the increase in Chinese protests over the last 30 years. They're getting more and more protests, even though the government is getting better technology. They're clamping down on it. They're still imprisoning people. They're still jailing people. They're still killing people. And they're killing everybody that speaks out against them. And yet people are still getting, more vocal about the fact that they want to be able to elect their government. And I think they should be able to.
I think you described the China of Mao Zedong era, but again, we can have like a special, I don't want to bore our
Yeah.
audience,
Well, we
but
don't have other hands up. That's the only reason I keep going down this path.
oh,
I hope
okay.
people don't mind.
I just want
We
to...
have this tendency, like if we've talked out the subject, and I feel like maybe we have if other people don't have their hands up. But if anyone has other things
Oh,
they want to say,
yes, I
yeah.
Garrett,
Yeah.
this is Jenny.
Go ahead.
You're saying you're eating a lot of Chinese food and Chinese seasoning and everything. Please be cautious, all right? That's all.
Why?
Because I just said earlier in the meeting, I absolutely distrust the food that comes out of China.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right about
Any
that.
sort of food,
Jenny.
any sort of food.
How much
Yeah.
food actually does come from China? I don't see that much food going all the way from China to here, is there?
South
Oh,
China
I think
Sea,
there's
most of your
yeah.
seafood.
maybe in the junk stores.
Other
Look,
than
guys,
seafood?
because
No,
A
no,
lot of
no.
seafood.
I don't
No,
know. I don't think
Interesting.
so, Yana.
I
I
think
yeah.
without visiting the country, we cannot really judge. Like when we talk about Bhutan, we really have to visit the country. But 90%, maybe even 98%, they have no clue what does it mean Bhutan. They have no clue what's going on in Antarctica. They have no clue what is going on in Himalaya. They can't even understand that the Himalayan area is like quarter of United States. It's huge.
So
And
Yana,
it's
if we
No,
could,
I
we
was
have a
just
couple,
desolate
concerned.
desert.
we have a
To do with
I
couple
was
hands
just
up,
concerned about Garrett, and
which is
his
very
diet.
thoughtful,
That's all.
Ginny. I probably should be more careful about what I eat that comes from China, so I will be more conscious of it. I appreciate it. So I haven't been going to the Chinese grocery store as often in the last decade. So but I do use like Chinese, well, Asian, various types of Asian seasonings, including Chinese stuff. So
But we are
Corinne,
buying the cheapest,
Yana,
best quality stuff. Sorry to chime in.
I
it's
think
okay.
Karen.
Yana, just put your hand up again if you put it down and then put it
I
up again.
will.
And
Yeah,
is
I
it
will.
Corinne?
I
Am I
will.
pronouncing that correctly?
Sorry, you
Yeah,
asked me?
definitely. You got that right. And I just want to chime in on the China thing because I
Please.
mean, one of my exes, one was born and raised in China. I have lots of friends that were born and raised in China. And one of my friends actually, during this past year, had to go back because she had family that was really quite ill. But were that not the case, she did make it clear that she would not have gone back. And it is because she is very concerned about the way that that government runs the country. And she doesn't feel safe when she's there. And, in talking to a lot of the people that I know that are from there, they don't want to go back as things are now. And it's because of the way that their government is running things. And when I talk about, but what about like vacation? Like, I would love to see like every country in the world. I mean, I think like countries are fantastic. Seeing different cultures is amazing. But when I talk about it, to them, because they're from there, I ask them like, what do you think? And without question, every one of them is quick to say, like, don't go there. Like this is not the condition under which to go there by any means. So I think it's telling that a country's own citizens, are, even though they love where they're from, they appreciate the beauty, they love their family, but they're making conscious decisions to not go back to a place that they definitely miss because of the condition that is happening right now.
Thank you, Corinne. I agree 110%, and I've had similar conversations with people who have left China and moved to the US. It's difficult because, I think the Chinese people that I've been friends with are very proud of the Chinese heritage and the Chinese culture, but often don't necessarily agree with the way that the government is run. And it makes sense. I do think the government has been largely on when I say good behavior, what I mean is they aren't making moves that are, Tiananmen Square sort of moves since then, but they are suppressing any kind of speech that's anti-government or even not pro-government. And there's a lot of there's no free speech in China. There's no such thing. You say the wrong thing and you can get put in jail or worse. It's easier on tourists, right? Because they want tourism. So I wouldn't tell people don't go visit China as a tourist. I don't think at least I haven't heard that it's at that level. But I also I wouldn't move there. Like, although I do know people, like I said, that lived there for over a decade. So some people disagreed with that. So.
Yeah, I just also read an article recently that a lot of people are leaving China, that they're having difficulty keeping Chinese in their country. That's something else I just recently read.
See, that's a very interesting thing, Jenny. Like I can see that being a pro, that might pressure the government to be more open to something other than autocracy. which I think would be nice. I think the increasing number of protests and people leaving, voting with their feet, quite frankly, and saying, look, we don't want to be a part of this, and we're going to go to a country has a free and fair democracy. That's kind of voting with your feet, and I think that's a great response for people to do. And depending on whether or not we continue to have a free and fair democracy in America, I might vote with my feet. So, we'll see. So, Charles, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, I don't know anything about China at all. And to argue against myself, what I said earlier about the best things that humans have ever invented is shipping and flying. Obviously, like, we've sort of done over ancient cultures by introducing shipping and flying to them. So I don't know. There's a sort of intersection, isn't there, between like capitalism, ancient kind of ways of doing things, ancient languages. Languages are actually very important here. Although, again, I've got no idea about Chinese at all. At all. I've got no idea. Absolutely no idea.
Just say ni hao and xie xie. That's hello and thank you. Those are the most important things to know. But thanks for your comments.
I studied Latin and Greek at university, and apparently there was a point where the Romans got to the edge of China, which is the same kind of boundary as it is now. And so there were these big Roman Italian boys, and they met this man who was doing a tea station, like a sort of cauldron tea station. And they sort of shouted at him in Latin. And he said, this is from a second-hand account, but he said something very Confucian, like, if you look up, you see eternity. If you look down, you see the reflection of the stars. If you look forward, you see backwards. If you see backwards, you look forwards. And they just looked at each other in absolute disbelief. And then the Romans just fucked off because they had no idea what was going on. So that's what I know about China.
Thank you, Charles. Yana, let's go quickly through the next couple of questions because it's almost 9 o'clock, and so we're going to wind down soon.
Yeah,
go ahead, Jenny.
Yeah, I'm obsessing about this, but one more thing about food in China. Again, this article, or was it a documentary that I saw about China and food, is that they don't have FDA in China. Not that FDA in America is perfect, but at least we have an agency, to sort of oversee the quality of food produced here in America. But China does not. And therefore, again, be very careful and be cautious about anything that is consumed into your body from China, please. Yeah. Okay, that's it.
No, I hear you. Thanks, Jenny. So Yana, since we've had you a bunch of times, I'm going to skip you real quick and go to Trask, if that's okay.
I'm trying to remember what Charles said that I was going to react to. I got lost in there.
Okay.
I'm not.
China is mysterious.
Yeah, you were talking about that, but it was a study of human nature you were talking about. I was just trying to pull it back in my head, and I can't pull it back because my memory is apparently shot. It's as bad as my mother's.
Well, then let's go to Yana for a final question or comment. Yana, you're on mute. We got your picture back. Great. Yana, are you still there?
She's speechless.
I was trying to unmute myself because I didn't mute myself, but when I mute myself, it's easier. But anyway, you raised very important questions that we couldn't even move on today, which is the freedom of speech. And a few weeks ago, you talk about whistleblowing, which is a fantastic topic. Maybe we can come back. And dissidents. So any country has dissidents. By the statistic, it's about 15 to 20%, but that's a whole different topic. I wanted to ask you more questions on the First Amendment. Like, in my opinion, it's absolutely should not be changed.
The First Amendment?
Yes.
Yeah,
Because
we didn't cover that. We covered the Fourth today. So
I don't think it's controversial.
well, actually, it might be because if you consider giving free speech giving money, then it could be controversial, right? So I would argue, yeah, we should keep the right to free speech, but if you call giving money free speech, I'm going to give my quick spiel here, which I've given before, but we have some folks that haven't heard it, which is, well, clearly, let's all be honest, free speech isn't taxable, right? You can't tax free speech. That's nonsense. How could free speech be taxed? And yet, if giving money is free speech, then I, as an employer, am just giving free speech to my employees. It's not taxable. And then, boom, I just defunded the entire US government by the argument of Citizens United. So really, like, it doesn't make sense that giving money is free speech. That's nonsense.
Money should not be in politics, period. So that
there should be no money in politics. I agree. I think anyone running for an office should have to get a certain amount of grassroots political support, and then they should get a budget, a tax-supported budget, and everybody has an equal amount of budget, and that's it. We should talk about that another night. So, but in any event, I have to go. My daughters are
Elizabeth Warren
had
bed.
So, thank you all for the great conversation, the great questions. I really appreciate you guys coming.
Thank you, Garrett. Thank you.
Special thanks to Charles for staying up all the way this late in the UK. I'm about to go to sleep
I'm
right
being so
now.
clever. Yeah, I've been so clever.
Thank you, Garrett.
Early morning. You go get some tea now.
So really nice to see all of the return people and new people and just the combination. I really appreciate this community. So thank you all for being a part of it. And we would love to see you again next week. Let me see if I can tell you what's next week. Oh yeah, next week is exciting. It's how to find and learn how to do your dream job with ChatGPT. So I will literally try to teach you how you can use ChatGPT to learn to do any job you want to do.
All right.
And it may not cover 100% of jobs, like potato chip taster. I can't cover, but what's that?
I'm president of the United States.
I actually am. I'm a jazz pianist.
Cool. Well,
I'll tell you what, actually, annoyingly, ChatGPT might be quite good at that. But anyway, I'll leave it to you next week.
There are other AIs that are very good at music. If you've never used, I think it's Suno AI that I used. It's really cool. And it creates like music with just a prompt, and it'll create a song, a custom song for you at a prompt. We should do another conversation about AI tools, because there are so, like, I'll do just ChatGPT and Dream Job next time, but if people like the idea of doing different AI tools, there's also now a lot of really cool text to video, and it's super cool. So
I think there's literally an AI in every single profession now.
There is, and AI is it's inescapable, it's unavoidable. It's the old board quote: "Adopt or you will be assimilated." And you have to be with the AI crowd, because if you're not, you're going to get left behind. And so the only direction to go is forward. And I would love to help this community learn how to go forward using AI, because that was my specialization in college, and I've been doing my own AI algorithms for 20 something years, and I use AI to great effect in my company as well. So we'll do a bunch of other series stuff on AI, but I also want to talk about how to combat terrorism, because I think that one's important. I think that we're getting it all wrong, and I'll try to make a good argument for that another night. So thanks again, everybody. Hope you all have a great night.
See you soon. See you next week.
There was a great thing.
Great discussion. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.